Psychological and political impact, deterrence, legitimacy, control. Erosion of Russian state authority. A successful instant strike on a rear area airfield signals that Russia cannot fully protect its own territory, weakening domestic confidence in state security institutions. Psychological pressure on leadership and population. Such strikes amplify fear, uncertainty, and internal criticism, especially when they contradict official narratives of control and superiority. International signaling. Ukraine demonstrates intelligence reach and operational credibility, reinforcing external political support and deterrence without direct escalation rhetoric. Strategic systems disruption, logistics, economy, governance. Strain on Russian infrastructure systems. Beyond aircraft loss, airfield strikes disrupt logistics networks, maintenance cycles, and regional transport dependencies. Economic and resource relocation costs. Russia is forced to divert funding, manpower, and technology from civilian or economic sectors into internal defense and reconstruction. Governance stress. Repeated internal strikes expose coordination gaps between military, security services, and regional authorities, complicating centralized control. This wasn't just an airfield hit. It was a message, one that didn't explode on the runway, but inside Russia's sense of control. If a supposedly secure military hub can be found and struck instantly, then the real damage goes far beyond destroyed aircraft. When we talk about strikes like this, it's easy to focus on the military footage and count what was lost. But that misses the bigger story. The true impact of this strike unfolds off the battlefield, in the psychology of power, the credibility of the state, and the hidden systems that keep a country functioning. To understand why this matters so much, we need to look beyond the military, because the consequences of this strike may last far longer than the smoke over the airfield. The psychological and political impact of a strike like this begins long before the first explosion and lingers long after the smoke clears. At its core, the power of such an operation lies not in physical destruction, but in what it reveals. States at war depend heavily on perception. Perception of control, perception of competence, perception of inevitability. When an airfield believed to be secure is suddenly struck, that perception fractures. It forces a recalculation not only among military planners, but within political leadership, state institutions, and the public consciousness. The strike becomes evidence that the official picture presented to citizens and allies no longer fully aligns with reality. For the Russian state, legitimacy is closely tied to the promise of stability and strength. A key element of domestic messaging has been the idea that threats are contained at the front lines and that the homeland remains protected by layered defenses and superior intelligence. An instant strike deep enough to bypass those assurances undermines that narrative in a way that official statements struggle to repair. Even if damage is minimized or denied, the mere confirmation that a strike occurred introduces doubt. Doubt is corrosive to authority, especially in systems where centralized control relies on confidence in leadership rather than transparent accountability. Psychologically, such strikes alter the mental map of the war. They collapse the perceived distance between conflict zones and everyday life. For citizens who believed the war was something happening elsewhere, the realization that military infrastructure inside Russia can be identified and targeted creates unease. That unease does not require panic to be effective. It manifests as quiet questions, private conversations, and a growing sense that official reassurances are conditional rather than absolute. Over time, this erodes the emotional insulation that allows societies to tolerate prolonged conflict. Within elite circles, the effect is sharper. Political leaders, regional officials, and security chiefs are forced into a defensive posture, not against an external enemy alone, but against internal scrutiny. Each successful strike invites questions about responsibility. Who failed to detect it? Who failed to prevent it? who failed to anticipate it. In highly centralized systems, blame rarely disperses evenly. It concentrates upward and inward, creating tension between institutions that are supposed to operate seamlessly. Intelligence services, air defense units, and regional administrations all become potential points of failure, and mistrust between them grows as each seeks to protect its standing. The leadership itself faces a dilemma. Acknowledge the strike too openly, and it validates the adversary's reach. Downplay it too aggressively, and it risks appearing disconnected from reality, especially in an age where satellite imagery, social media leaks, and foreign reporting circulate rapidly. This tension forces messaging into a narrow corridor, often resulting in vague statements that satisfy neither domestic audiences nor international observers. Over time, repeated incidents widen the gap between rhetoric and lived experience, weakening the persuasive power of state communication. Internationally, the psychological signal is just as important. Allies and adversaries alike watch for indicators of resilience and vulnerability. A successful strike on a protected site suggests not only intelligence penetration, but also operational patience and confidence. This reshapes how external actors assess the balance of competence. Supporters of Ukraine may interpret it as proof that assistance is yielding strategic dividends, reinforcing political will to continue backing Kyiv. Neutral states may resist assumptions about Russian dominance and risk tolerance. Even adversarial governments observe the lesson that Russia's internal defenses are not impermeable. Deterrence also shifts in subtle ways. Traditional deterrence relies on the threat of overwhelming retaliation. Psychological deterrence, however, is built on uncertainty. When a state can no longer be sure which assets are exposed and which are safe, it must assume vulnerability everywhere. This forces leadership into a constant state of anticipation, which is mentally and politically exhausting. Resources must be allocated not only to fighting the war, but to reassuring elites, calming the public, and signaling resolve to the outside world. Each of these demands competes with the others, diluting strategic focus. Another layer of impact emerges in the realm of narrative control. Modern conflicts are fought as much in information space as on physical terrain. A strike like this becomes a story that resists containment. Even if domestic media avoids detailed coverage, the narrative leaks across borders and platforms. Attempts to frame the incident as minor or inconsequential often clash with visual evidence and foreign analysis, creating cognitive dissonance among audiences. Over time, repeated dissonance conditions people to discount official messaging altogether, not only about the war, but about broader issues of governance and security. The psychological burden extends to the military itself. Personnel stationed far from the front may have believed their roles carried minimal personal risk. A sudden strike disrupts that assumption, introducing stress and heightened alertness. While vigilance can improve readiness in the short term, prolonged anxiety degrades morale. Service members begin to question whether leadership can truly safeguard them, which subtly affects cohesion and trust. These effects are rarely visible in headlines, but they accumulate quietly within institutions. Politically, the strike narrows leadership options. Escalation risks international backlash and economic consequences. Restraint risks appearing weak or ineffective. This strategic squeeze is itself a form of pressure. The adversary does not need to force a specific response, it only needs to limit the range of countable choices. Over time, this constraint shapes policy decisions, rhetoric, and internal power dynamics, often in unpredictable ways. Perhaps most importantly, such strikes redefine what security means in the public imagination. Security is no longer a static condition guaranteed by geography or military size. It becomes something fragile, contingent, and constantly tested. Once that realization takes hold, it is difficult to reverse. Even successful defensive measures implemented afterward are perceived as reactive rather than authoritative. The state is no longer seen as an impenetrable shield, but as an actor responding to pressure. In this way, the psychological and political consequences of the strike ripple outward, touching confidence, legitimacy, deterrence, and narrative authority all at once. The physical damage may be repaired, runways rebuilt, and assets replaced, but the altered perception of power endures, reshaping how the war is understood both inside and outside Russia long after the immediate event fades from view. The strategic systems impact of a strike on an airfield reaches far beyond the immediate loss of equipment or temporary disruption of flights. Modern states operate through deeply interconnected systems where military infrastructure, civilian logistics, economic planning, and governance are tightly woven together. An airfield is not just a military asset, it is a node in a wider network that supports transport, supply chains, command coordination, regional employment, and industrial scheduling. When such a node is suddenly degraded or rendered unreliable, the effects propagate outward in ways that are difficult to contain or quickly reverse. One of the first pressures emerges in logistics. Airfields play a critical role in moving personnel, spare parts, fuel, and specialized equipment across vast distances. Even if aircraft losses are limited, the uncertainty surrounding the safety of the site forces planners to reroute the operations, extend supply lines, and rely on less efficient alternatives. Each adjustment introduces delays and increases costs. Over time, these inefficiencies accumulate, slowing operational tempo and reducing flexibility. What appears to be a localized strike thus quietly degrades the overall performance of the system supporting the war effort. Maintenance and readiness cycles are also disrupted. Aircraft and support equipment depend on predictable schedules, specialized facilities, and trained crews. Damage to infrastructure or the threat of repeat strikes forces maintenance operations to be dispersed or relocated, often to sites that are not optimized for the task. This increases wear on equipment and stretches technical personnel thin. The system becomes more fragile, not because it has lost all capability, but because it is operating closer to its limits with fewer buffers against error or delay. Beyond the military sphere, civilian infrastructure feels the strain. Many airfields share resources with civilian aviation, emergency services, or regional transport networks. Fuel supplies, power grids, communications links, and road access are rarely exclusive to one function. When security restrictions tighten or repairs begin, civilian traffic is often deprioritized or suspended. This affects regional economies that depend on transport connectivity, from manufacturing deliveries to agricultural exports. Businesses face uncertainty, insurance costs rise, and investment decisions are postponed or cancelled, all triggered by a single strike that altered risk calculations. The economic consequences extend into state budgeting and resource allocation. Responding to internal strikes requires rapid investment in air defense systems, surveillance technologies, physical fortifications, and personnel. These expenditures are rarely planned for at scale and must be funded by diverting resources from other areas. Infrastructure development, social programs, and regional subsidies may be delayed or reduced to accommodate emergency security spending. Over time, this reshapes national priorities, subtly shifting the state toward a more security-focused posture at the expense of long-term economic growth. Governance systems also come under pressure. Protecting critical infrastructure involves coordination between military commands, internal security services, regional authorities, and private contractors. A successful strike exposes gaps in this coordination, prompting investigations, reorganizations, and new chains of command. While such reforms are intended to strengthen resilience, they often create temporary confusion and competition between institutions. Decision-making slows as responsibilities are redefined and approval processes multiply. In centralized systems, this can bottleneck authority at the top, overwhelming leadership with operational details that distract from broader strategic planning. The strike also forces a reassessment of geographic assumptions. Assets previously considered safely distant from the front must now be treated as potentially exposed. This leads to dispersal strategies, relocation of facilities, and changes in basing doctrine. While dispersal reduces vulnerability to single strikes, it increases logistical complexity and operating costs. More sites require protection, more routes need monitoring, and more personnel are tied up in defensive roles. The system becomes larger and more expensive to sustain, even if its overall output remains the same or declines. Insurance and risk management frameworks adapt as well. State-owned enterprises and private firms operating near military infrastructure may face higher insurance premiums or reduced coverage. International partners and suppliers factor increased risk into contracts, raising prices or demanding additional guarantees. This affects procurement timelines and costs, particularly for specialized components that already face supply constraints. The cumulative effect is a slower, more expensive system that delivers less certainty for planners and policymakers. Another less visible impact lies in information and data systems. Airfields are hubs for communications, navigation, and command data flows. Even brief disruptions can force reliance on backup systems that are less efficient or more vulnerable to error. Increased cybersecurity and counterintelligence measures, implemented in response to strikes, can restrict information sharing and slow coordination. While these measures aim to enhance security, they often reduce transparency and responsiveness within the system, making it harder to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Regional governance is affected as local authorities are drawn into national security concerns. Regions hosting targeted infrastructure may see increased oversight from central agencies, reduced autonomy, and heightened scrutiny of officials. Development projects can be frozen, land use restricted, and populations subjected to additional security measures. This alters the relationship between the center and the periphery, sometimes generating resentment or passive resistance that complicates administration. Over time, these tensions weaken the cohesion needed to manage prolonged crises effectively. The cumulative strain on systems produces second-order effects that are difficult to measure but significant in the long run. Skilled personnel may seek transfers away from high-risk locations, creating talent gaps. Training pipelines become congested as new defensive roles are created. Emergency preparedness exercises replace routine operations, consuming time and attention. Each adaptation, while rational in isolation, adds friction to the system as a whole. Strategically, repeated internal disruptions force leadership to operate in a more reactive mode. Planning horizons shorten as attention shifts to immediate vulnerabilities rather than long-term objectives. Investments favor quick fixes over structural improvements. This reactive posture reduces strategic coherence and increases the likelihood of misallocation of resources. The system remains functional, but it becomes less efficient, less resilient, and more prone to cascading failures under additional stress. Ultimately, the significance of such a strike lies in how it transforms the operating environment. The state must now assume that critical nodes can be identified and targeted, compelling it to defend everywhere rather than concentrate resources where they are most effective. This dilution of focus is a strategic cost that cannot be easily reversed. Infrastructure can be repaired and defenses strengthened, but the systemic shift toward heightened internal security permanently alters how resources, authority, and attention are distributed across the state.